gospel in our lectionary text that we've been dictated to preach on today all over the world comes to us from the Gospel of Luke, the gospel that we have been looking at for many weeks now. This is Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. This is what Jesus has to say to us today. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those for whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The good news of God for the people of God. Would you please pray with me? Gracious and loving God, may these words of my mouth and this meditation from my heart be filled with your Spirit, filled with your truth, and may they be heard, and may we hear them, opening our mind, our heart, the whole of ourselves, for a message that we need to hear for our lives today, for our world today, for our church today, and for your eternal kingdom. Amen. Well, if you have been here worshiping at the UMCPS at all this past few weeks, you will know that one of the main things that we've been talking about is how we are called as Christians to relate to the other, the person or the people that are different from us, whether it's because of the way they look, the way they think, the way they act. It's natural, seems to be in humankind, to want to distance ourselves from people that are different from us, to be afraid of them, to perhaps deal with our fear by putting them down, by distancing ourselves, ultimately by hoping that they leave our community so that our community can be right again. Because all the people in our community are just like us. And because we like the way we are, we're right. And they're wrong. Now, this is not at all the way that Christians are called to act. And we have been learning different ways that we do this, and different scriptures that call us not to do this. Well, today the rubber really hits the road as we get to the nub of what all of our life as Christians is supposed to be about, what it all comes down to. Loving our enemy. The person that we not only dislike a little, but the person that we dislike a lot. The person that we not only want to distance from ourselves, but perhaps even destroy. Jesus, in no uncertain terms, says we're to put those ideas out of our head and to love, to go out of our way, to be kind and generous and sacrificing ourselves to the people that we find most difficult to be with. It's very dramatic and very intense teaching that Jesus does for us today. It's brings to us today. And it brings to mind for me one of the labs, perhaps, that Jesus presents of what loving your enemy looks like. And we get that in a few chapters later when Jesus is teaching and a lawyer that's in the crowd says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, you must follow the two main commandments. Love God above all else and love your neighbor as yourself." And the lawyer then goes, "Well, teacher, who is my neighbor?" And then Jesus goes into a story, a parable, about a man who's walking down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And robbers come upon him and not only take all he has, but they strip him and they beat him and leave him half dead on the side of the road. Then Jesus says a priest walks by from the fancy temple in Jerusalem and ignores him. Then a Levite, an assistant to the priest at the fancy temple, walks by and ignores him. Then a Samaritan walks by and picks him up, tends his wounds, takes him to a nearby inn, tells the innkeeper to take care of him, and when the Samaritan comes back, he'll pay the innkeeper for whatever is owed. Then Jesus says, "Now," to the lawyer, "now what would you say? Who would you say is the neighbor here?" And the lawyer says, if you read the text, and I quote, "The one who showed mercy." Now, we who read the story know that what the lawyer means to say is the Samaritan. Why doesn't he say the Samaritan? Because for the Jewish people that were hearing Jesus' story, the Samaritans were the most hated group of people the Jews had in their, that the Jews knew. And why were they hated? Well, they lived nearby the Jewish community. The Samaritans are just a little bit north of the Jewish people. And the Samaritans were kind of half Jewish. Many of them had intermarried with Gentiles at a certain point in their history. So they were like the Jews, but not quite like the Jews. They worshiped God sort of like the Jews did, but not quite like the Jews. I read one author saying that the Samaritans and the Jews, the ancient Jews, were a lot like the relationship we might find today between the Serbs and the Muslims in Croatia, or the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland, or the gangs in Los Angeles or New York. I might add the relationship of the Israelis and present-day Palestinians, or, yes, I'll say it, the relationship in this country between the Republicans and the Democrats. These are pairings of people that have some differences, but also a lot of similarity. And somehow that creates a mixture, an atmosphere for intense hatred, to the point where in this parable, the lawyer can't even say the word Samaritan. What does that parable teach us? Well, usually when we hear this parable, we say to ourselves, this teaches us that we're to be kind to everybody, even and especially the person we least want to be kind to, just like the Samaritan was. We're to be good Samaritans and to do good to our enemies. That's a very helpful message. But perhaps Jesus' parable is taking things even deeper. When I was in seminary, I had a New Testament professor that was talking about this parable, and he said, now let's think for a minute that we have this group of people listening to Jesus who are, Jewish people, Jewish regular people, who in this parable, which character are the listeners most going to relate to? Are they going to, when they hear this story, relate to the priest that walks by? No, they're not priests. They're not in the priestly class. Or the Levites? No, they're just regular folks. How about the innkeeper? No, none of those folks are innkeepers. Are they going to relate to the Samaritan? Oh, heavens no. They would do anything but be a Samaritan. So, my professor said, who in the story does that leave? It leaves the guy beaten up on the side of the road, who is rescued by the Samaritan, by the enemy, who comes to see the enemy as his savior. Think about that. saviors? That's intense. That's an intense message. And that, I think, calls for a very intense kind of love, where we're not doing for people that we don't agree with, but we're letting ourselves be vulnerable and appreciative for what they may do for us. How do enemies save us? That's, I think, the question of this parable, and might ultimately be a question we can ask as Jesus tells us that we need to love our enemies. Maybe one of the best ways we can get to that difficult teaching is to let ourselves embrace the ways that our enemies save us. And there's a lot actually written about this, and trust me, I'm probably going to do a sermon series on it because there really is a lot. I just wanted to touch on a few ideas here. One way that the people that we most dislike, that drive us the most crazy, that we most want to get out of our lives, save us, is because so often they provide a mirror for what's really going on inside of us. Think about anything that drives you crazy about somebody else. Chances are they are providing a mirror to us about something that we're still struggling with. We may think we've gotten over it, but it's still in us, and they're making us realize it. I know for myself, and this doesn't apply to anybody here, of course, but sometimes I get driven crazy when people start complaining. I think, why don't you just be more joyful? I've developed an ability to be more joyful. Why don't you like that? And then I realized, you know what, Jane? When you're home alone and deep inside your little voice, you're complaining all the time. And you hate yourself for it. And you're letting yourself be mad at somebody else for something that you still need to really work on. When I let myself see that, I'm actually grateful that I've had that insight from my reaction to that person. And I feel much better about myself, more healed, and I'm not anywhere near as angry as I was at that person who was before my enemy. So that's one way that we might start to see our enemies in a more blessed light. Another way is that our enemies teach us empathy. Our enemies, if we're to get along with them all, force us to get to know them before we start making judgments of them. I forgot to bring the book, but the Bishop Karen Oliveto, who is the only openly gay/lesbian bishop in the United Methodist Church, who is at this conference in St. Louis right now, wrote this incredible book called Gathered Around the Table. And she spends a whole chapter talking about empathy and the importance of Christians to have empathy and how we aren't good at doing empathy. She says, when I was ordained as a bishop, I started receiving all sorts of hate mail from people calling me all sorts of names, people that didn't even know me. How could they possibly make those kinds of judgments when they don't even know me? I was thinking, it's sort of like yelling at a cardboard cutout of somebody. I mean, how silly is that? I mean, it's foolish and totally hardening of one's heart. She said, that people need to get to know one another before they start making judgments about somebody and their behavior and who they are. She says, but it's not only they. She says, this experience has taught me how important it is for me to do the best I can, to get to know the people who have all an agenda against me, so that I can better understand them and better come to have a conversation with them, rather than just get into a shouting match over ideas. So again, we can be grateful for our enemies who force our hearts to get softer and softer and softer, which is the place we want to be in any case. Then there's the opportunity that the receiving blessings, there's the opportunity as those who love our enemies to become great peacemakers, no matter who we are, no matter where we may find ourselves. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, in a great sermon he gave called Loving Your Enemies, which he gave in November of 1957, begins with him telling his congregation that loving one's enemy is the topic that he looks at more than any in his work, and he tries to preach twice a year on the topic, sharing new insights that he's gotten. And in this particular sermon on loving your enemies, he tells a story about when he and his brother were driving down the road from Chattanooga to Atlanta. It was at night. And he says it was night, and every car that drove by us did not dim their lights as they came by. Every car. And it was driving, my brother was driving our car crazy. Why aren't they dimming the lights? At one point he said, the next car that drives by refuses to dim their lights, I'm going to fail to dim mine and pour them on in all their power. Then Dr. King quickly said, oh no, don't do that. There would be too much light on this highway, and it will end up in mutual destruction for all. Somebody's got to have some sense on this highway. Then he continues, somebody must have sense enough to dim the lights. And that is the trouble, isn't it? That as all of the civilizations of the world move up the highway of history, so many civilizations, having looked at other civilizations that refused to dim the lights, and they decided to refuse to dim theirs. Dr. Toynbee, a famous British historian, tells that out of the 22 civilizations that have risen up, all but about 7 have found themselves in the junk heap of destruction. It is because civilizations fail to have sense enough to dim the lights. And if somebody doesn't have the sense enough to turn on the dim and beautiful and powerful lights of love in this world, the whole of our civilization will be plunged into the abyss of destruction. And we will all end up destroyed because nobody had any sense on the highway of history. Somewhere, somebody must have some sense. Men must see that force begets force. Hate begets hate. Toughness begets toughness. And it is all a descending spiral, ultimately ending in destruction for all and everybody. Somebody must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate and the chain of evil in the universe. And you do that by love. That's something that all of us can do when we find ourselves in the escalating spiral of violence or anger or hate or argument. We can choose just to step back and to love, to break that spiral, and to see what happens when we do. In fact, what this all leads to, the idea of using our enemy as our mirror to our hearts and letting ourselves become more empathetic with all others and being peacemakers and refusing to continue the spiral of violence. What we do is we create space in our heart and in the distance between one another and in the world. We finally create the space for God's Spirit of love and creativity and endless new possibilities to come in and to guide us and to make the changes in us and around us that indeed are needed and wanted and blessed. We have this conference going on in St. Louis. We have a lot of people with a lot of agendas and a lot of fear, a lot of justifications for being angry and afraid and putting up walls, a lot of desire to bring down those walls. And all I can do is pray, and all I invite you to do is pray for them that they may too find ways of loving their enemies. This is the lectionary text that they're probably hearing sermons on even as we're hearing them today. And seeing in their enemies the opportunity for salvation. Not just getting along, not just doing for others because we're supposed to, but finding the deep need we have for one another because of the difficult differences that we have. And who knows what that will mean for our denomination and what it will look like. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of modern families that are so prevalent in our world today, and oftentimes are created by those who have discovered a different sexuality than what is the norm, and have come to see that we can be together in all sorts of different ways that don't necessarily look like they're supposed to or the way it's always been. And maybe our denomination is moving into that direction. And there's nothing to ultimately grieve about or be angry about, but to see that this is God's way of forming us into more authentic community for who we are at this time and place. If we can claim that, then we will be a beacon of hope for all institutions everywhere that struggle to somehow maintain some sort of system that has always been, but may not work so well anymore. What I'd like us to do for a few moments before we move into our time of communion is to spend a little time in prayer, praying for peace, praying for charity, and praying for all that they may find in their enemy, their perhaps most valued neighbor. The way we're going to pray for the next couple of minutes is by singing a short chant that comes from the community of Taizé. You'll find it, I forget what number it is in our hymnal, but it's...
2179.
What number is it?
2179.
2179 in your black hymnal. Taizé, if you don't know, is a community in France. It's a spiritual community, it's a monastic community, but it's an ecumenical community that was begun by a Protestant pastor in 1940. It's a community that's dedicated to peace across religious lines, and people, especially young people from all over the world, gather there to learn and to worship and to pray. And so often their form of music are these short chants that they offer up and sing over and over and over again. So we're going to sing this chant, Caritas, Live in Charity, several times. And when Wayne stops playing the piano, we will sing it together 2 more times, and then we will end. And let the music and let the constant repetition of words bring you into a deeper place, make your imagination start moving, your heart start moving, let images come however they may, and let this be our prayer for the world, and especially a prayer for our church today.